Amazing. And we are live. So today, in this first session to kick off the summer, I'm really excited to have Brendan D. Murphy, jumping on here to give an incredible talk on lenses on voices and visions. So the author and host of Truthiverse podcast, Brendan has blown minds and changed lives around the world. Author of an incredible book, The Grand Illusion. I'm sure he will mention it, share a bit with you guys about it. It is incredible. It's huge, just if you're checking it out, and incredible. And co-founder of the censorship-free Facebook Alternative Truth Network. Brendan will probably push buttons. He's really good at it, but I think that's why people like him. So welcome, Brendan. And yeah.
Thanks. Thanks, Sam. The words thing is always fun. Thank you. All right. Well, I've got a little slide presentation, which I think I'll just jump right into and do a bit of a screen share here. So just bear with me for a moment. I'm a bit of a tech tard myself, so things tend to go wrong. But of course, that won't happen today.
No, not at all.
No chance. With me at the helm here. Here we go. Present, and can you see the screen share?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. All right, cool. Thanks, Sam. So my little talk is lenses on voices and visions beyond the false dichotomy of madness versus divinity. So it's a little bit of a kind of a tour through a few different ways of looking at this, which, for the most part, they all tie together. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. One of the things I like to do is look at things from a lot of different perspectives, which is why I find Sam and her perspective quite interesting. She's always got a very unique perspective to share, and she's one of the more compelling and intelligent humans that I've met over the years. So yes, hopefully this is something along the lines of what she's after. She really doesn't have a clue what I'm going to present. So some of what we're going to cover is the bicameral era and the voices of the gods. I'll explain any terms you don't recognize. Divine encounters, the brain's interaction with the quantum field, shamanic experiences. We might have a chance to mention entity attachment. We have an entity or two pictured. The pre-bicameral era will have a brief mention, but we won't spend too much time on it. N-dimensional beings and plasma, and encounters with the collective unconscious. A lot of these things really tie together, and sometimes we'll be talking about, these different terms are actually pointing to the same thing. So just by way of quick intro, Sam already gave me a pretty sterling introduction, but I'm Brendan. Obviously, go by the name of Freedom Hacker or Truth Addict. They're a couple of my handles. And hang on, here we go. A little bit about me. I've been doing this for nearly 20 years. Next year, I'll be able to say I've been doing this for 20 years, so I'm up to 19. I host a podcast called Truthiverse.com, and you can find the episodes at BitChute, and some of them on YouTube, but some of them get taken down because I'm a naughty boy who believes in freedom of speech and freedom of thought. And YouTube and most of the big tech platforms don't like that. I published my book book 1 in 2012. As Sam said, it is huge. And if you're into these subjects, you'll like it. If you're into these subjects, you'll really, really like book 2 even more, which will be out next year. I'm still just finishing that off. And I run something called Evolve Yourself, which is evolutionary DNA activation work and transformative inner work, shadow work type stuff, all good things. So that's me in a nutshell, and I want to just intro you to a little bit of a timeline of consciousness. This is really kind of ridiculous that I've even decided to talk about this stuff in a 45-minute time slot, because I really need 4 to 6 hours minimum. So on the left, you'll see 12,000 years ago, prehistoric proto-shamanism, and then the question marks symbolize the fact that we know less about that time frame pre-12,000 years ago than we do about the modern era or the bicameral era. So the bicameral term itself came from Julian Jaynes, Dr. Julian Jaynes, who's a psychologist. And he had this massive revelation, which I'm going to explain. I'm going to tease that out a little bit. And in this bicameral era, we had a very different experience of consciousness. We had a radically different state of mind to what we have now. We tend to make the assumption, modern humans tend to make the assumption that what we experience as mind and consciousness or awareness must have been the same down through the ages. But what Jaynes proved, he saw things that other people didn't see. And he proved essentially beyond any reasonable doubt, I think, that actually that's not the case. And the ancients, it's particularly from 10,000 BC to around about 1500 BC, 1000 BC, had a radically different experience. So I'll get into that and explain that. In a sense, they were more robotic. They were more like automatons. They did not really have a conscious freedom of will in the way that we experience it. We could call this the pre-conscious era. And they experienced their will in terms of voices and visions, which probably sounds really bizarre. And because everybody heard voices back then, nobody had mental illness. They didn't have the concept of mental illness because, let's face it, if everyone hears voices, then nobody's insane. And obviously, you know, these are terms, these are figures of speech. I'm not actually saying that you're insane if you hear voices. So if we move forward through that era, and I'm going to explain more of what the bicameral era is, if we go into around about 1500 BC to 1000 BC, then that is when the state of mentality actually starts to radically shift. And it was because the culture that humans were in was radically changing. We had things like 4000 BC, we had the development of writing, and culture itself was becoming more sophisticated and complex. And that all those developments were changing the way that our brain actually worked and interacted with itself. So then we became self-aware. At some point, that increase in complexity generated a level of awareness we'd never had before. So we went from being kind of robotic automatons into subjective internal beings with our own self-conscious intentional will. So we can visualize ourselves, like I can visualize a version of myself, a virtual version of myself who, you know, if I wake up in the morning, I'm like, oh, what am I going to do today? What do I want to do? And I go, okay, maybe I'll walk down to the pool, and I visualize myself walking down to the pool. Okay, yep, that's how that's going to pan out. And yeah, that sounds like fun. Then I'll get some food, and I can narratize myself in this virtual kind of reality. And that's something that the ancients through the bicameral era didn't have the capacity for, which becomes quite obvious if you study the texts, or at least the work that James did studying these texts and all the other evidence. So a monumental leap in consciousness actually occurred. And with that loss of the voices and visions that were completely normal and day-to-day, we lost contact with the so-called gods. I'm going to explain that more. And we eventually developed the people who could still hear voices became known as prophets and oracles, and they became stigmatized eventually in the modern era as having mental illness. And obviously mental illness has a sort of relevance within, you know, limits. But I don't like the way that it is weaponized by institutional psychiatry. So anyway, bicameral versus self-aware. We are in the self-aware era from, say, 1000 BC to now. The last 3,000 years is the only time in history that we've had the kind of self-awareness that we've got. So another way of putting it is that we are aware of being aware. The bicamerals in that ancient time frame of 10,000 BC to, say, 1500 BC, they did not have consciousness of being conscious. They didn't have that meta level where they could step back and see themselves in that sort of virtual way that we were talking about. They couldn't picture themselves going for a walk down to the park and narratizing these events, these virtual events in their minds. They didn't have the capacity. They were more like our domesticated pets in the sense that they were just present with their the immediacy of their sensory input. And that was basically it. And there are actually some rare people alive today who still function like that. And we consider them, they're considered to be quite unusual and very interesting because the rest of us, you know, the rest of us have this internalized awareness, but they don't. And it's extremely unusual. So back then in the bicameral era, what James showed was that when people needed to make a decision, when they experienced some kind of novelty or stress that required a choice, they would hallucinate, essentially internally hallucinate the voices of a god or the gods, some kind of a deity, and it would tell them what to do. Nowadays, now that we've left the bicameral era, culture and complexity forced our brains to adapt and evolve, we have an internalized volition and will. We can think about things and go, maybe I'll take this path. No, maybe I'll take this path. They didn't have that option. A voice spoke up and told them what to do, and they did it, and they didn't have a choice to disobey or obey. They just had to do it. That was the situation they found themselves in. Now, we can internally debate ourselves. It's very different. So to summarize this, and Sam, if you want to jump in with any questions. I mean, I know we don't have heaps of time, but I'm just like, if I really need to elucidate something that I've skipped over, feel free to, jump in.
Yeah, for sure, I will. This is actually just amazing listening to and sort of actually restructuring or like evaluating how I've felt about it and relating it back to this. It's kind of quite intriguing. So yeah, no, keep in flow, and for sure I'll jump in with a question if I've got it.
All right, rock on. Cool. So to summarize this timeline a little bit, flesh it out a little bit more for you. And again, I'm only giving you like a teaser taster overview of all these subjects because they all need like hours to really get into it. So in the second millennium BC, we stopped hearing the voices of the gods, the deities, and they were known as the Elohim, Lord, Yahweh, these types of terms. In the first millennium BC, so 1000 to 0, the year 0, people who still heard them to some extent, heard the voices, were known as oracles and prophets, and they started to die out. They were actually persecuted and hunted down as well. That's actually documented in the Bible, for example. And then in the first millennium AD, these divine inspirations of these prophet-type characters became preserved in what we call sacred texts. And that allowed non-bicameral literate humanity to retain contact with its lost gods. So the gods receded from us as our brains changed. The voice inside that we used to hear, which made decisions for us, became our internal monologue, and we became a little bit more sophisticated and able to make kind of free will conscious decisions, which we didn't used to have. So when the gods left, we were left in charge of ourselves. Essentially, in a sense, we became the gods. And this has to do with the right brain communicating with the left brain, which I'll get to. So following on from that, the second millennium AD, these sacred writings basically lose most of their authority. So that's the general timeline as outlined by Janes in The Origin of Consciousness, in the breakdown of the bicameral mind. Terrible name in terms of marketing, a book, just awful. Okay, so Janes's insight was profound. And I'm not a reductionist, I'm not a materialist, he seemed to be. So he interpreted everything of this nature as simply an internal hallucination. I'm going to show you that it's not quite the case. So he tells us in the book, the amalgamating of admonitory experience was a right hemisphere of the brain function, and it was excitation in what corresponds to Wernicke's area that occasioned the voices of the gods. So there's this part of the brain on the right-hand side that corresponds to the left, around the temporal lobe on the left, which is known as Wernicke's area. And what happened was, in situations of stress where people needed to make a choice in the bicameral era, the right side of the brain would trigger a communication through what is called the Anterior Commissure. It would send a signal through, and basically it was us making a decision, but it was experienced internally as the voice, like an external voice basically shouting at us to do something. And we experienced it as gods or gods, deities, and we just did it because you don't argue with God, right? So that's how we ended up with the voices of the gods, and it was a standard day-to-day thing. It was not abnormal at all. Basically, in the stronger form of his model, he suggested that this right hemisphere admonitory function, which is like a warning kind of function, or, a do this, don't do that kind of function that this part of the brain served, it was actually received, the signal was received from the right into the left side of the hemisphere and decoded as a voice, which had to be obeyed. They literally didn't have a choice as to whether or not to do what the voice was telling them. They actually, and really, they would have been disobeying themselves or arguing with themselves. So that wouldn't make sense. They just did what the voices told them to do. And so just because there may be a vague term here, the admonitory aspect of this is, what he's talking about is the way that we go through life and we learn from our seniors, our elders, our authority figures, what to do, what not to do. They condition us. And so the voices that people hallucinated, even though they attributed them to gods, it was this accumulated kind of conditioning and experience telling people, oh, here's the decision I need to make in this situation. So that's Wernicke's area on the left. It has to do with language processing. And there's a corresponding part on the right side of the brain in basically the same area, which was, he was saying, sending a message over to this left-hand side, Wernicke's area, where it was then decoded and literally experienced as a voice, like an external voice. And this is what the biblical prophets were experiencing to some extent. We'll talk about one or two examples here. So Jacob, allegedly circa 1500, around 1500 BC, he is spending the night in a field outside of Haran on his way to Haran, and he lays down to rest or sleep. We're not actually sure exactly what he was doing. So the Hebrew Bible, which is the basis of the Old Testament, tells us that he had a shalom, likely meaning that he entered into a state of peace or tranquility, aka an altered state of consciousness. And the etymology of shalom is not actually 100% certain, so context is key in unraveling exactly what the passage is telling us. So In his reverie, Jacob, who was the grandson of Abraham, saw, quote, a ladder set up on earth and its top reaching heavenwards, on which, quote, angels of the Lord, that is Malachim, were busily going up and down. And that's from Genesis. So he's having this altered state experience, this divine vision in his reverie. And it kind of fits James's timeline quite nicely if it really did happen around 1500 BC. And a lot of the biblical dates are very highly disputed. We won't get into any of that. But in that time frame, around 1500 BC, because of the neurological evolution we were going through, we were losing contact with the gods. We were having less divine visions, hallucinations, whatever you want to call them. And we were having to go into altered states or use, say, hallucinogenic plants and what have you to have these types of experiences, whereas they used to be quite quotidian, commonplace, day to day. So it was suggested by Brian McVeigh, actually, that he may have been sleeping near a ziggurat or a temple of some sort, hence the reference to, a ladder, which could be interpreted as stairs. And so if that's the case, you may know that a lot of the temples, ziggurats, pyramids have been put up, constructed on places around the earth that are considered sacred sites. They have anomalous aspects to them. People tend to have certain types of paranormal types of experiences there in these places. And that's why they build these structures there, to exploit that, to harness the energy, that kind of thing. So it's possible that he was sleeping nearby one of these types of structures. Next slide. Okay. To finish this, I'll just continue the quote. So the Lord himself stood at the top of the ladder, announcing himself as the God of Jacob and his forebears. And Jacob thereafter exclaimed, "Indeed, a God is present in this place, and I knew it not. How awesome is this place! Indeed, this is none but the Lord's abode, and this is the gateway to heaven." So one way of looking at this is that one of the many local tribal gods or lords, Yahweh, whatever the name was, they're all basically on more or less on the same level. Could be interpreted something made an appearance to him in his altered state, or that it was an activation of this latent or vestigial bicameral function of the brain. So it may have been a combination of the area he was in, the electromagnetic properties of the area. Maybe there was a temple that was harnessing energy, which stimulated his brain, the right-hand side, to generate one of these amazing divine sort of hallucinations. Maybe it was simply a contact that was allowed because he was in an altered state. We don't actually know. So in Jacob's Shalom, a visionary experience unfolded, and it may have seemed to him that a doorway was open between our realm and the so-called angelic or heavenly realm. And it's generally an interpretation that's consistent with many UFO and contact experiences from the modern era. So one of the things that James said in his book was that everyone was schizophrenic back in the bicameral era. So because everybody heard the voices of God, and hallucinating the deities was commonplace. When Achilles went to react to Agamemnon in a fury, he experienced the god Thetis grabbing his hair and pulling him away. And that was the internal neurological process of his own mind and brain making a choice for him to not harm or kill Agamemnon in that moment. And that was just normal. So everybody back then, we would look at it through our modern lenses saying, well, they were kind of all schizophrenic in a way. But yeah, because of that, mental illness didn't exist. There is a very famous other biblical patriarch fellow called Ezekiel, who is featured in the book of Ezekiel, funnily enough. And he had some very interesting experiences, which actually had some quite shamanic aspects to them. And Professor Benny Shannon, who is a psychologist, actually suggests to us that the verses in the book of Ezekiel actually describe hallucinations that are very similar to those experienced on ayahuasca. And the primary ingredient of ayahuasca, if you're not already aware, which you probably are, is DMT. So it's a major hallucinogen. And he's not saying that necessarily Ezekiel took this substance per se, but he's making the comparison and saying the type of experience Ezekiel describes is actually very similar to what a lot of ayahuasca experiences in the modern era describe. Incidentally, most contact experiences with so-called alien beings or what have you happen in the early hours of the morning when the pineal gland is most active, so potentially generating its highest levels of DMT. And I'll come back to Etta Frechka, who is a Hungarian gentleman scholar, who tells us that high stress also triggers elevated DMT levels, and people often have encounters at points of high stress in their lives. And I can include myself in that. I saw at a very pivotal moment or stage of my life, as I was going through a breakup process, and I was about to have to leave a beloved pet behind and move move out of the state. And, you know, one of those very significant moments in your life where there's so much meaning. And it's often those points, those pivotal points, choice points, where there's a massive amount of meaning or something's on the line, something's at stake, that a lot of people have these contact experiences. And I was standing out in the backyard one night, and it was sort of early evening. And I had the impulse for no apparent reason to look up in the sky directly above me. And I saw a huge orange disc. And as soon as it realized that I had consciously registered that it was there, it took off and it vanished very quickly. It actually vanished by phasing out. It didn't go over the horizon and disappear. It actually phased itself out and disappeared. So I know, like from experience, the reality of this type of thing happening at key moments, pivotal moments in someone's life. And I've marveled at the number of times I've seen, you know, like born again Christians, for example, say, you know, at this point of meltdown, complete meltdown in their lives, they had a strange experience, which, you know, they've interpreted through a Christian lens and what have you. Anyway, that's another tangent. Psychedelic access to the gods is quite possibly what was going on in the Near East and many other places. This image bottom right of the screen, I think, comes from around about 9th century. And it's a Mesopotamian clay tablet, which shows in the background a plant that looks very much like Peganum hamala, which is top right there in the corner, top right. And in front of it, obviously, is a very unusual looking being, reptilian head, bird-like wings, humanoid general form, and holding a pine cone, holding its ritual bucket there. The types of beings, the types of chimeric, strange beings that people often encounter in UFO experiences, altered states of consciousness, psychedelics, you name it. So again, there's a hint here in this tablet that the people in this phase coming out of the bicameral era were actually systematically, intentionally, ritually using hallucinogens to continue to be able to have divine encounters. And that probably actually goes back, that behavior goes back probably many, many thousands of years prior. We just know a lot less about it. So yes, acacia and Syrian rue are found in the Near East, which is where a lot of these biblical prophets obviously were located, like Ezekiel. He was actually a priest in exile in Babylon in the 6th century. So again, BC, I should say. So again, coming out of the bicameral era and into the conscious, self-aware, subjective era, post-bicameral. And so Syrian rue actually amplifies the effects of DMT, and acacia contains DMT. Both of those plants are found in the Near East. So it's quite plausible that these people were having hallucinogenically triggered experiences. This is Michael Persinger, Dr. Michael Persinger. He died in 2018, unfortunately, so we can't ask him about these things and his fascinating work anymore. Some of the research he did was around near-death experiences and other types of paranormal experiences. I've done a lot of research into near-death and other types of stuff, which I'm writing about extensively. And what they found was that most aspects, and I stress the word aspects or elements of a near-death experience, an NDE, could actually be triggered in an experimental setting with minimal electrical current induction to the temporal region of the brain. Now, they weren't triggering full-blown whole, like integrated or integrative near-death experiences. They were triggering fragments, elements. So it's not quite the same thing. But they learned some interesting things. And they found that people with a natural tendency towards electrical sensitivity in the temporal lobe, or what they call temporal lability, can be seen as comprising the so-called encounter-prone personality type and may be naturally more susceptible to different types of paranormal experiences. He goes on to tell us that people with higher temporal lobe activity have higher levels of creativity, suggestibility, memory capacity, and intuitive processing. Many possess a rich, subjective, internal experience. Sam comes to mind there. Fostering adaptability. They have more frequent experiences of sensing a presence and endorsed so-called exotic beliefs over traditional religious experiences, which is quite an ironic kind of a comment, I find, because if you actually do the digging and the research, you can see that our Judeo-Christian religions and the core dogmas and tenets and the prophetic experiences actually have emanated from these exotic places, means, techniques, and are analogous to bicameral epileptic episodes, so-called epileptic or schizophrenic episodes. So where James and I part ways is that he never touched the paranormal. He didn't go into the transpersonal realm. Transpersonal realm is the paranormal realm. It's the quantum realm. In this red circle here, I want you to just notice, I don't know if you can see my mouse moving, but here there is a face in the background And you can clearly make out there's a bottom lip, there's a chin, there's the outline of a jaw, there's a mouth that looks to be wide open, there's a nose, and then some very strange looking, very large eyes. And this, to me, suggests some kind of gargoyle-like figure. This is an entity that manifested over the left shoulder of my ex-partner when we were living in Melbourne. And there is absolutely no doctoring of this photo. It has not been manufactured. It is an actual legit image of an entity that has manifested. So cameras don't hallucinate. Cameras don't have a bicameral mentality or brain. They simply show what they show from the frequency spectrum that they can, view from. So temporal ability is strongly correlated with psi experiences, including clairvoyance, precognition, and so on and so forth, as well as a proneness toward visual imagery, hypnotic suggestibility, and dissociativeness, according to Persinger. As you can see here, sometimes when clairvoyants talk about beings or entities, they aren't just hallucinating. There is something there, and we can see them. We can photograph them. Depends on the equipment you're using. One of the very interesting characters from the Middle Ages is Joan of Arc, and this is well into the subjective phase of consciousness. We have a lot more in common with Joan of Arc than we do any of the Mesopotamian characters, or the really old school prophets that we've talked about. She had subjective conscious awareness, and she still had these interesting experiences with bright lights manifesting, descending from the sky, communicating with her. There are actually witnesses to some of her communications with these lights. And sometimes they actually physicalized and became tangible humanoid beings who were actually solid enough for her to hug, literally wrap her arms around them and hug them. And other people saw these lights and what have you. So it's not like she was just simply having an internal subjective hallucination. What happens in the UFO and contact phenomenon, which goes back thousands of years, as far as we can see, is that the beings manifest themselves in a way that is recognizable to the human that they're presenting themselves to. So they appeared to her as recognizable, personages, or presented themselves that way. The thing about Joan of Arc is she doesn't, these aspects of her experience and her story, and she has a massive, very involved story, and it's hugely tied in with paranormal experiences. She only lived barely 20 years, but very, very, a very involved story there. And she was heavily involved with these paranormal experiences. She made successful predictions. She had foreknowledge of certain things, and she actually managed to find Frankish military leader Charles Martel's lost sword, which was hidden in a church for a number of centuries, something like 700 years. And she knew where it was, somehow knew where it was, and went and found it. So she had access to information that she shouldn't have had, which, again, this shows the limitations of James's reductionist model. This is where we part ways, because sometimes what we are hallucinating is quite real. It's just a matter of interpreting it. One of the things that we can touch on briefly is that there are certain areas on the planet, certain places and locations like fault lines, geological fault lines, places where there's a lot of quartz in the ground or metal ore, where there is the ability of these substances to actually emit electrons, and these electrons can generate plasma formations, and plasma formations can then become quite strange and interesting things. So geoactivity, geological, geomagnetic activity can lead to earth lights, plasma manifestations, and also, these fault lines and what have you, these active areas can also potentially stimulate our brains to maybe facilitate some enhanced communication with another world beyond the veil, so to speak. What was I going to say here? So yes, I'm going to talk a little bit more about plasma, just so I can qualify that and show why it's relevant. And it's funny, there's a pattern of anomalous experiences and strange lights appearing around areas where there is a buildup of tectonic tension and stress. And then when the earthquake hits and the tension is released, the manifestations actually die out and they stop for a while. So there's something very interesting going on there. This is one of these fascinating books that ties a bunch of the different strands together, connects the dots. So Collins and Little are both talking about UFOs as plasma entities. And they can be formed geologically quite organically, but then something strange tends to happen to some of them, and they can start behaving as if they're conscious beings, start interacting with people, even telepathically. And so they're proposing the idea of these plasmas as a window into a hyperdimensional realm or an n-dimensional realm, n just representing any number of dimensions. It could be 6 dimensions, 11 dimensions, what have you. So n-dimensional beings inhabit these hyperdimensional realms. Obviously, we have no way of knowing how many dimensions or what have you, where they come from really, but we can call it, the quantum field or the implicate order or hyperspace or whatever you want to call it. So what Collins and Little are kind of proposing is that these plasma constructs can actually then, even though they're organic formations, they can actually, well, sometimes they're organic formations. I'm not going to say they're always, but sometimes they are. And even when they are, they can become windows for hyperdimensional intelligences to then operate through. So Basil Hiley called it pre-space. He was one of David Bohm's colleagues, David Bohm, the physicist, and Bohm called it the implicate order, whatever you want to call it, hyperspace. Doesn't really matter for our purposes. I just want to show you, if you haven't seen a shape-shifting, unidentified entity in the air, this is what one looks like. Here's a pretty great example. This is very recent. Someone was in a plane, they pointed their phone out the window of the plane, and this is what they captured. There's no sound. You can see at the end here, it looks like this being has stood up and raised its arms in the air, and you can sort of see a head shape there. I've watched it a few times now, and I just got chills because I just noticed things that I didn't notice the first couple of times. That is quite mind-blowing. All right, so that's what, whether or not that was a plasma formation, that is some of the things that plasma formations can actually do. They shapeshift. They can separate, they can go apart, fly around. You see UFOs, these lights in the sky fly around and then rejoin. And that's always baffled us until maybe now, when we realize we can explain this stuff through plasma. It is the most abundant form of matter in the universe. And funnily enough, the most recently discovered or realized. And basically just charged particles, a so-called gas of charged particles. So they're very versatile, and they seem to facilitate very paranormal events. So regarding some of these ancient visions and prophets and what have you, one of the a major site as far as the Judeo-Christian tradition is concerned is Mount Gerizim in Palestine, which is known as the dwelling place of God, and something called the Shekinah was known there for centuries, been known for centuries, and it was the divine light of God, and this was something that manifested, this light, and hung around this particular mountain, and the people of the time and many years prior interpreted this kind of stuff as God or the gods or what have you. And an example of a modern place where this type of thing still happens is Skinwalker Ranch in the Uinta Basin of Utah. Again, shape-shifting beings, really strange stuff going on, and in an area where there's a lot of crystalline substance in the rocks, the rock formations in the ground, what have you. So it lends itself to these types of plasma formations and lights and whatnot. There is an interaction between these beings very often and the people who are watching them. Like I said, when I looked up at the UFO and it seemed to realize that I was now seeing it, it took off, and that kind of behavior is quite widespread and quite common. So I mentioned David Bohm called the fundamental ground of reality from which our reality emerges from. He called it the implicate order. And a lot of these concepts overlap. Like we could talk about the collective unconscious. We could talk about, my friend Nick Sambrook calls it. That's him bottom left there. I should have labeled or something, but I don't just put photos of random blokes' faces on the slides. It is actually the author of the book there on the right, It Pieces in the Dark. I've known Nick since 2014, very smart, very perceptive guy. And he's helped really elucidate the dynamics of the collective unconscious, what it is, how it operates, how it manifests and can physically manifest from, lights entities into even physical solid entities. And one of the more radical examples of a UFO contact that I've ever read, and I've read a lot, is there was actually an eyewitness report, from the modern era, and there was a platoon of soldiers walking through they were walking along a mountain range, and someone watched this happen. So there was a group of these guys. A craft came down and landed on the mountain, calling it a craft for want of a better term. but it opened some kind of a hatch or portal, and the troops proceeded to walk into it. And at which point, once they were all inside, it took off and disappeared. I'd love to know what happened to the guys who got on that thing. I started to think, hopefully, maybe best case scenario was some kind of like time travel experience that they're now in a parallel, time frame on Earth or something. Hopefully nothing too challenging. But yeah, this is really bizarre stuff, and that was one of the more extreme cases. So literally, the collective unconscious can manifest into even physical solid objects. And I talk about this in book 1, the ways that we can generate energy, manifest energy unconsciously and consciously. Robert Monroe did an experiment with a group of people who generated intentionally a red kind of like neon light, a wavy neon light up in the sky. And that was just through a group effort, a small group of people at that. So you can imagine when you have billions of people feeding psychic energy into a belief system, an idea, the amount of psychic power that comes in behind that can be enormous, and you can have some very powerful and strange manifestations. So UFOs and so-called ETs are probably largely what we could call tulpoidal or thought form emissaries emanating from the implicate order, or if you want to think about it in terms of the collective unconscious, Nick calls it it. And technically, it's all us. It's kind of like the manifestation of us on the other side of the mirror, poking your head into, we were talking about like the other side of the mirror being a reference to Alice in Wonderland, or Alice Behind the Looking Glass. Is that what it's called? And so even though we always tend to look at these things in terms of, well, the other, the self and not self, self, not self, these things manifesting over here, that's not self, this is me over here, self. But ultimately, in a quantum reality, in a holographic reality, and the mystical reality, the mystical tradition is that, as far back as we can trace any form of mysticism, everything is ultimately one thing. Everything is one. So technically, everything is a manifestation of us. And one of the reasons why the UFO contact phenomenon manifests in ways that people can recognize the manifestation is because it is intimately tied in. At the very least, we could say that whatever that intelligence is that's showing up is very aware of the belief system, the beliefs and the perceptions of the people of the era that it's appearing in. And so we've had ships manifest flying in the air like seagoing vessels, but flying through the air completely, in defiance of the laws of so-called laws of physics, dropping anchor, creating all sorts of havoc. And that's an example that's actually in the literature. And that was from, I think, maybe the 1800s or so. An example of the technology matching the era that it's showing up in, whereas now we have a much more, we think of things in terms of space travel, extraterrestrials and that kind of thing. And so these entities, intelligences, what have you, tend to show up looking more like that. They present themselves in a way that it's kind of like not violating our expectations too much. So they clearly know the psyche of humanity. And I think at least some of the time that's because they are literally a manifestation of the collective unconscious of humanity. Nick does a pretty good job of explaining all this, the way that it works in his fictional books, It and Blue Angel Night. So as I've mentioned, there's a shamanic thread here. We're not really going to spend any time on the pre-bicameral era because we won't have time to, other than to point out that we know less about that era than we do about anything else. There is this shamanic thread running through all of these visionary experiences. And Jacques Vallée tells us that the symbolic display seen by the abductees is identical to the type of initiation ritual or astral voyage that is embedded in the occult traditions of every culture. The structure of abduction stories is identical to that of occult initiation rituals. The UFO beings of today belong to the same class of manifestation as the occult entities that were described in centuries past. So whatever this is showing up has been with us for a long, long time. One famous example of this is Betty Andreasen, who had a very bizarre contact experience with all sorts of beings that you can see in the picture here. And I do believe that the aliens professed a belief in Jesus at some point. So it was all happening. It was a menagerie. And again, a reflection of the fact that this intelligence knows what we believe and what we think. And it presents itself in a way to kind of mirror some of that back to us without violating too much of what we expect, I guess. Though sometimes it clearly does violate that. And Dr. Kenneth Ring has spoken to this shamanic theme that runs through all of this. And he says that we see the elements of separation, the appearance of the cosmic shaman, dismemberment ordeals, death and rebirth motifs, esoteric knowledge, and the return to the physical world with a special sense of purpose. Betty, too, has been shamanized. And So the aliens, so-called aliens, play this role of the cosmic shaman, and the cosmic shaman shows up in all sorts of forms, trickster, what have you, and it seems to perform. It seems to be more of a function than a group of beings or entities from that sense. This is some shamanic artwork by Pablo Amoringo, who has based his art, which is amazing, on his ayahuasca experiences, and you can see an incredible amount of detail there. You've got all this natural nature imagery. You've got celestial cities. You've got UFOs and flying, bizarre winged creatures flying in the air. You've got the rainbow serpent down the bottom. You've got mermaids in the water, all sorts of things. All of this, angels in the middle, all inspired by his experiences with the hallucinogens. So there's a great article from Luis Motorman, which I'm going to quote from. He tells us that Amoringo's descriptions of what ETs are doing in his paintings is seemingly as much part of our own abduction lore as it is of interdimensional origin, as described in the interaction with nature spirits, shamans, and holy humans in an extra-dimensional setting. Excuse me. So some elements also sound reminiscent of our own UFO lore. The shape-shifting abilities, the sudden appearance when being called on, the ancient astronaut analogies, and even the disappearances underwater. Now, just to clarify, because I skipped over this earlier, the ancient astronaut references, if you look at the last 12,000 years through the bicameral lens, which is a very powerful and incredible revelation and insight, and hopefully I've got a couple minutes left because I think I'm close to the end, but not quite there. I've got maybe 4 or 5 more slides. Hopefully Sam's not freaking out. But the ancient alien reference or ancient astronaut reference, that is, most of that came out of the bicameral era, incidentally, as it happens. And so it needs to be really heavily, strongly revised with that awareness. And I just have never seen, I've actually never seen anybody in that realm acknowledge the monumental Janesian insight, which shows us that the gods, these so-called ancient astronauts, were actually, for the most part anyway, hallucinations occurring as a result of right brain, left brain communication. I'm not saying all of it is, but I just wanted to mention the ancient astronaut theme there because there's a lot of misconceptions around that. So Pablo Amoringo tells us that these vehicles may take many shapes and are able to attain infinite speed, can travel underwater or under the earth, and the beings in them are like spirits, having bodies more subtle than ours, appearing and disappearing at will. And you can see in this picture, there's this sort of modern looking, I don't know, cruise liner type ship, which goes to show, you know, in these types of visionary experiences, there can be this real mixture between what's anachronistic or really ancient and really modern. And that's reflected in a lot of people's contact experiences. Jacques Vallée tells us that the modern global belief in flying saucers and their occupants is identical to an earlier belief in the fairy faith. The entities described as the pilots of the craft are indistinguishable from the elves, sylphs, and lutins, and pixies and goblins of the Middle Ages. Through the observations of unidentified flying objects, we are concerned with an agency our ancestors knew well and regarded with terror. We are prying into the secret commonwealth. And they were quite right to regard some of that stuff with terror, because some of the experiences people had were absolutely terrible, and people sometimes disappeared and did not come back. So I'm getting close to the end now. I just want to mention quickly, hopefully I'm not going too much over time, the brain's contact with the quantum field. It gets a little more technical. I get into this more in the book, in book 2 in particular. And this is Dr. Etta Frechka, who I quoted from earlier, and he's saying basically DNA is receiving our information from the microtrabecular lattice, which is woven around the microtubules, which exist inside the cytoskeleton of our cells. So these are incredibly small structures, incredibly fine, measured in like a handful of nanometers, incredibly fine. So this is visualized as being what is most in communication with the quantum field and deriving that energy from it, or the information, I should say. So spirit beings mediating non-local internal perceptions have more informational value than the entities of strictly internal intrapsychic projections. So if you are actually having a genuine kind of transpersonal interaction with the quantum field or the collective unconscious or the implicate order, whatever you want to call it, there is the potential for massive informational value and perspective that comes through with that. Of course, some interpretation is often necessary in terms of the messengers delivering it or what have you. And he also tells us that when we use our direct intuitive non-local consciousness to override our linguistic cognitive mode of functioning, which is what we're using now to say words and share these ideas, we can then tap into the consciousness and information of the plant and the animal kingdoms as the seers and the shamans, and maybe some schizophrenics and temporal lobe epileptics and what have you, and interesting people like Sam are doing. So I'm going to skip that. So the telos, if you want to jump in, Sam, please do. I know I'm going a million miles an hour here. But the telos of transformative experiences, to wrap this up, basically, we are also talking about massively transformative experiences, whether they're near-death experiences, contact experiences, shamanic initiation, what have you. It is an experience of altered reality. And then there is time necessary. Even my DNA activation work follows this pattern, this pathway that I do with people. Altered reality experience. And then there's a time frame of integration where we grapple with it, we work with it, we feel like we're changing somehow, some sort of a perceptual shift has occurred, a metanoia has occurred. And then over time, the human that comes out of that is transformed. They're radically different to the human who went into the experience initially. So this is the pathway that most of this stuff we've been talking about, all the different contact experiences and what have you, actually follows. And I do believe I'm at the last slide. So thank you for listening. You can follow me, Brendan D. Murphy Official, on things like Telegram, Instagram, and also I've got Truth Network, which is an uncensored platform for people who value free speech. Back to you, Sam.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Brendan. This has been incredible. And yeah, really just seeing how the language we have about our experiences, our ability to explain them, make sense of them. And like for you to bring this research, you know, the kind of historical, the looking into texts, the science lens to put words around different people's experiences is incredible. So very grateful for that. I actually had this moment of, you know, when you have a vision of an event and it's like, it's so exciting just to see it come together. So I do think you need a whole day. I think this is a full day event with like multiple sessions and just little bits of space for people to go, wow, what does that mean? How have I experienced that? Because for me, even listen, like I loved every bit of this, but listening to it sometimes the words can get heavy or technical, like a, you know, direct non-local something in like intelligence, like what does that mean, you know, and when do I feel that, or what's the experience, how do I know when that's happening? And for me that's the bridge I really am connected to, you know, trying to translate that. So I'm like, yeah, this has been amazing. I'm so excited for people to watch this and check it out. I'm really excited and just pleased you jumped in and shared this. So hoping everyone has more incredible questions, that this opening frame got you guys thinking about how we can understand experiences in a bigger way. One kind of question before I'm curious, before you go, Brendan. What kind of experiences of voices and visions have you had? Do you have any that you want to share? I know you mentioned the UFO, which was really cool, but like, what?
I've had some pretty epic meditational experiences. And I've done a bunch of plant medicine, but I've got to say the most profound stuff has been without any form of external. It's just sitting in meditation, and I've had a few very profound visuals, but I have a tendency to go, there's something about the way I'm wired. My nature is to go to like the fundamentals or the biggest picture rather than like, I tend to bypass the intermediary, like the beings and the intermediary beings and the astral stuff and all this. And I go to like infinite consciousness. So that's kind of the foundation of my like paradigm and my awareness. And I've, you know, had a sprinkling of some plant medicine work around that's been interesting, but yeah, I wouldn't emphasize that that's been as amazing as certain, you know, just natural or so-called natural, you know, self-guided type stuff. But yeah, I've had some interesting things, but I'm not prone to like visions or voices as such. I don't have that necessarily wired into me, and I stopped working on clairvoyance a long time ago. So that if you it's like they say, you know, use it or lose it.
Yep. Amazing. Yeah, just so excited to have this incredible, like, broad perspective research, you know, approach to give us a few different, you know, labels, descriptions, lenses, ways of seeing experiences. And I also really loved how you had a few comments in there around that not everything we're seeing and receiving is good. Like, it's not always great. We don't need to pedestal it. It's about really understanding how do we interface or interconnect or with these experiences, and even the part of that it is us as well on some level, like that that infinite consciousness, that side of it. So yeah, how do we wrapping words around it's been incredible. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, mate. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Anything final you want to share?
I'm actually glad you mentioned that about the whole, it's not always good, or don't put it on a pedestal. I had a thought there that was actually quite quite lucid that I wanted to share around that. And now it's basically gone. So hey, let's just wrap it up.
Yeah, look, it's been important for me. I've had as many difficult experiences as amazing ones. And the book is focused on those that were a lot more, as you said, transformative or healing. But it's very much looking at where's the midpoint? Where's the midpoint without, finding a new narrative about how we include this inside the story of, who are we as humans evolving and, developing consciousness. So yeah. Super grateful. Yeah. Love your work. Thanks, Brendan.
Thank you. Thanks, mate. Cheers. Appreciate it. And I like that. I'm going to say, like, moving beyond the dichotomy of divine or insane or good versus bad, or getting rid of the moralistic lens. It's not about any of that. It's about understanding what's going on and making the inquiry into that. And you may never get an answer, but at least make the inquiry. And that's my mentality around it.